The big economic news came out of the Federal Reserve yesterday, if we can put up A1 here. This is Fed Chair Jerome Powell saying that he's actually going to be ramping up interest rate increases much more significantly than he had planned in the past. He came to Congress yesterday and was grilled by Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren on what the implications would be for unemployment. Let's roll Warren here.
Chair Powell, if you hit your projections, do you know how many people who are currently working, going about their lives, will lose their jobs?
I don't have that number in front of me. I will say it's not an
just
intended consequence.
But it is, and it's in your report, and that would be about 2 million people who would lose their jobs, people who are working right now, making their mortgages. So, Chair Powell, if you could speak directly to the 2 million hardworking people who have decent jobs today, who you're planning to get fired over the next year, what would you say to them? How would you explain your view that they need to lose their jobs?
I would explain to people more broadly that inflation is extremely high and it's hurting the working people of this country badly. All of them, not just 2 million of them, but all of them are suffering under high inflation. And we are taking the only measures we have to bring inflation down.
And putting 2 million people out of work is just part of the cost. Let me ask you about what happens if you do this. Since the end of World War II, there have been 12 times in which the unemployment rate has increased by 1 percentage point within 1 year, exactly what you're aiming to do right now. How many of those times did the U.S. economy avoid falling into a recession?
You know, it's not as black and white as very.
Just looking at the numbers, it actually is pretty black
Alan
and white.
Blinder's written a book on this.
There have been 12 times that we've seen a 1 point increase in the unemployment rate in a year. That's exactly what your Fed report has put out as the projection and the plan based on how you're going to keep raising these interest rates. How many times did the economy fail to fall into a recession after doing that? Out of 12 times.
I think the number is 0.
I think the number is 0. That's exactly right.
What I like about this is that it's a clash of real conflicting values.
That's a good point.
On the one hand, Elizabeth Warren talking about the millions, 2 million unemployed people that Powell's policy will produce. Like, that's not only is that 2 million people who are now able to pay their bills, finding dignity in their work that no longer can and no longer do, but then you push fear all the way through the workforce and you discipline the workforce, and a militant worker who might have wanted to organize into a union or push for a raise or push back against sexual harassment or other abuse in the workplace. Now all of a sudden, I'm not going to be able to get another job if I lose this one. And so everybody's life gets worse. Versus the other value of prices are rising too fast, and that sucks for people.
Right.
What was your response to that?
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. It's hard for me to give Elizabeth Warren the moral high ground in that question, and obviously that generally applies to conversations about politicians. But when you're saying, how much spending, for instance, did Elizabeth Warren support that has been making working people's bank accounts bleed because the price of eggs is exploding, and it's not just eggs, of course. It's the entire consumer price index. If you look at basket of groceries over the last several months, the last year and a half, basically, how much of the spending that contributed to those price hikes has Elizabeth Warren supported? And so part of this is putting everyone between a rock and a hard place, either Jerome Powell and Elizabeth Warren, like both of them between a rock and a hard place, because from Elizabeth Warren's perspective, and sometimes I think correctly, we need to spend more on X, Y, and Z package, but we also know that will contribute in some ways to a rise in inflation. We're nowhere near a hike that looks like Volcker, right? Like, we're not exactly back to that time period yet. We're not suffering under anything quite to that point. Hopefully it doesn't get to that. But the point is letting inflation get out of control and supporting measures that let inflation get out of control. I don't think gives you the moral high ground then to go to Jerome Powell and say, basically, you're intentionally putting people out of work, because that's part of the story. It might be true, but it's part of the story.
And to me, the problem here is that it's not necessarily the case that the treatment is going to cure the disease. And I worry that 20 years from now, if we have some more sophisticated economic modeling capacity, maybe ChatGPT can do that for us, we'll look back and be like, what were these economists thinking? You'll have left-wing economists saying, well, we know what they were thinking. They were serving the interests of the elite. Right. But the ones who were saying, let's pretend and take for granted they're actually trying to kind of manage the economy in the most effective way possible, it's almost as if these are doctors who are bleeding a patient because they have a fever. The way that George Washington had like 8 different doctors that each individually bled him, and then because you would have some people who recovered after they were bled,
right.
You had the medical profession be like, well, bleeding actually works. Look here, this happens, and so the question then becomes, how does kind of raising the unemployment rate affect prices if prices are either related to ecological or virological crises, or to corporate greed? There have been reports out that up to 50% of the price increases that we've seen have come from corporations who have opportunistically raised prices and didn't have to because wholesale prices were rising. So that's half. We also know, you mentioned the eggs. The bird flu has wiped out like millions, approaching billions of birds around the world, and there's no interest rate move. And I think that makes us kind of sad as humans, as economists, because we want to be able to control everything. We want to think, well, if we do something about our quantitative easing policy, then
we'll prevent the avian flu.
then avian flu.
With 75% confidence, we can predict that the avian flu will be mitigated by our interest rate measures.
That's right. I think some pro-Iranian militias launched some strike on a chicken farm in Syria. Like maybe that'll do it. Maybe that'll do something about bird flu. That happened pretty recently. But so, and the same is true when it comes to kind of ecological crises. That if the planet is not able just to function in the way that it does at this carbon concentration for this 9 billion people, as it was for 6 billion people at lower carbon concentrations, what does that do to our economic models? And how does moving the interest rate and moving the unemployment rate actually help there?
Well, yeah, and there's the 2 million number, which he didn't even have off the top of his head. I think that was a pretty bad look, first and foremost, that it was in his own report, as Elizabeth Warren pointed out, and Jerome Powell couldn't mention. Maybe he didn't want to say the number, but it seemed like perhaps he was just entirely ignorant of it, which I think is telling in and of itself, because it treats people, or it contributes to this idea that the mentality among people sitting at the Fed is that people are numbers, and numbers can be massaged, and we can take care of this with a formula, which may or may not be the case for everybody over at the Fed. But when you don't have that number from your own report, and you're unwilling to say it, then yeah, that's a problem. So, but the question then also, I think, becomes, what does all of this do to wages? What does all of that do to corporate profits? To your point, I think that's one area where the right has totally missed an opportunity over the course of the last year. There is good reporting on how corporate greed has contributed to all of that, and obviously Elizabeth Warren would be on the right side of that conversation. But I mean, their models can't really account for a lot of that stuff.
Right, and just to underline the point about worker power, you'll often see a lot of people who will say, well, look, I'm sorry that 1 or 2 million people are going to lose their job, but 330 million people are suffering through higher prices.
Yeah.
But the reason that unemployment drives down wages is because it spreads fear throughout the entire economy. Like they're not just going to fire these 1 or 2 million people and then magically wages go down and prices go down. It's because they're firing those people as a warning to you. So every single person in the workforce and every single person who depends on someone in the workforce, which almost gets to 300 some million people, is actually going to suffer from higher unemployment rates. So I think, and perhaps we've had low unemployment now for so long that people forget what that fear and what that pain is like, and they might regret getting what they asked for. Yeah,
and there's not going to be some sort of like patriotic hug from corporate America to workers as a reaction to the organizing, which like the numbers on the increase in organizing over year to year have been really, really like staggering jump in organizing.
And that is a direct consequence of full unemployment, and that goes away when you lose full unemployment, which is why somebody like Jerome Powell would like to see the numbers go up a little bit.
And like, he's not wrong that there are trade-offs. And I think Elizabeth Warren is maybe glossing over that for the sake of asking those questions in a very particular way. But to your point, yeah, there's a broader aperture to make those trade-offs with them.
Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now, and Sagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
Yeah, we rely on our premium subs to expand our coverage, to add staff, to upgrade the studio. We just want to give you the best independent coverage of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us, and if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.